This machine is an older machine. However, it's been refurbished and now works better than new. I tend to prefer the vintage machines as they are less general parts and they are very robust. This is a upgraded hybrid version of a cooperative brand circular sock machine. All right, so let's go over the parts. What has come standard with the machine and with a few extra bits that you see here. I guess I should have added this part here. It doesn't really fit. Anyways. Okay, so what part is the first and most important part? Well, that part is this part here. This is called a bed plate. It's easy to remember the name because it's the bed. It's the base, the foundation of the machine. It has the part that has the badge part on it. This part here is where the mast or the part that's vertical attaches to. In some machines, they have a screw that's gone in and can help secure that mast. This doesn't have that, but that's fine because it just sits there. On mine, I upgraded it by putting a screw through there and threading it, and it just better secures the mast, but it's not necessary. So this is the bed plate. And the bed plate, if we turn it on its side, is the part, of course, that connects your machine to your table. So you need to have a table that is no thicker than about an inch or a little bit over an inch, or this machine won't be able to be clamped onto it. And we clamp this onto the table by simply turning these turn screws. Okay, they do come all the way out, but you will firmly secure this on the edge of a table and then tighten up these parts. Now, if you're using a beautiful wood table and you've clamped this to that, you may find that these posts will damage the wood, of course, because you're forcing basically a bolt into the wood. So what some people do is they will either put a thin sheet of metal, or put maybe a dime on top of these. But the way these work is, of course, by tension, by screwing them tight. So you want to make sure that both of them are firmly attached to the table so that there's no movement of the machine on the table, okay? However, let's just turn it over. This is what the bottom view is. Not a lot going on, but these two screws are important. This screw hole here and this screw hole here are the two screws that attach your cylinder later. All right, the screws will go through there and that'll secure the cylinder later on the machine when it's better assembled. But so you know what those two parts there are. And we continue looking. This part here is the part that is the stem that holds the crank wheel. And the crank wheel is this next part that we'll review in just a moment. This one over here, that you hang onto the handle and you turn it. And by turning it, it causes the gears to turn and the parts of the machine to go around and around, causing your rows to happen when you're knitting. It has a end part here that a washer and a screw will go on to hold the crank wheel. So looking at this, now this part here is nothing on this machine, but in more modern machines, like an auto knitter or a Laguerre, there is a drill through hole through here and an adjuster that a ribber would be attached and used with. But this one does not have a ribber. So this is pretty much a design feature here, not really doing anything. All right, so let's look at this. So when you're looking at this bed plate, you'll see that it has a flat outer step, a next step up, and a next step on that. So each has a designed feature. The next component we'll add to the machine is something called a cog ring. And it is exactly that. It's a ring with a cog on it, or rather a set of teeth that go around and around. And this functions quite easily by being assembled by simply placing it so that it sits in that very first step, okay? When attached to a table, and this part is just simply sat on that first step, All right, and it easily goes in circles. Now there is no current oil on the machine, so you're going to hear rubbing of the metal on metal. All right, so this is the cog ring. Many machines have a part similar to this, and this talks to the crank wheel I'm pointing at and allows the machine to turn around or go in reverse. So that's pretty much it there. In a moment, we'll attach this to a table to make it a little more handable, a little more handy. But I wanted to show you on the cog ring 2 features. One feature here is the screw that's attached still. Good way not to lose them is leave them attached. And this will be where the yarn carrier attaches to. And what the heck is a yarn carrier? It carries the yarn, so it's pretty easy to think of that way. And the yarn will come out from the top of the machine down into this hole and then through to the inside of the machine. And it actually installs very easily like that, and you'll just tighten the screw. So don't tighten the screw too tight when you do install it, but that's it there. And then the other feature I want to show you with this are these 2 stops that are on both sides of the cog ring. These are the parts that touch what's called the camshell and help push the machine forward and back. And let's see, where does that touch? Okay, so the cog ring right here, this stop will touch here when it's going in one direction, and this one on this side will touch the other side when it goes in the other direction. So these parts are all very integral. All right. So we're going to take our bed plate over to a table. This is the table I'm using today. This is an accessory table that breaks down into very few parts, and it's actually a very light table, so it's very handy. It's assembled by 3 leg parts and one down the back that are attached here with a screw. All right, I have had this tabletop especially colored, or rather powder coated, by Chambord CSM, Dave Lord, a couple years ago now, as the normal table is black. That's what you see on the legs. I've also modified my table to give it further features. Not essential, but that's what it is. And I'll include a picture of it. What you're not seeing here is this lamp, which is very handy, that the ring has had the magnifier taken out of the middle. And it allows for easy seeing of everything you're doing on the machine. So let's install our bed plate on the machine by simply tightening these 2 screws on the bottom of the table. So let's do that first. So you want to firmly connect the edge of your tabletop to the machine and then tighten those screw parts underneath. Make sure you turn them the right way. So I am turning, looking down into the machine. I am turning, looking down, turning it counterclockwise, the screw. If I was looking at dead on, it would be counter, but I am turning, looking from the top down, so top down. Yeah, there we go. Tight, and it's tight. Now this tabletop is metal, so I'm not concerned with the surface of the screw hitting it. And it's certainly very attached at this point. Okay. All right, I want to back it up so you can see a bit more. All right. So I am going to adjust the angulation here as if I would be using the machine. I sit at the machine, if this is where the crank wheel will be, I sit at it so this part, which is the 6 o'clock position, is pointing to my belly button. All right, so here's our bed plate. Now what? Well, we can do the most easy part first, why not? This is a length of a post. Simply put one tapered end into the access hole here. There you are. And now we want to attach our topper. And for the ease of this video, I'm going to take it out, of course, and do it where you can see. So this is the topper, yarn topper. All of these are vintage parts, unless otherwise noted. Of course, it's a brand new paint job. So this has a topper where it has a heel spring, and a heel spring is just being held nicely. It's like piano wire. There's a nice bounce to it. It's attached by a screw here that you'll just leave on, and it's holding the coil. Okay, very easy. And basically what happens is the yarn will come from your cone source, and it'll come up in one of the two legs here, either this one or this one. The yarn will come up and it'll go through this tunnel there. When it comes out of the tunnel, it will be correctly threaded if it comes out over the bar, which is the yarn break, and then through this little tunnel here, and then into here, the front part of the topper. And when you do it this way, should you decide to use or engage your heel spring later, you would hook the yarn as it's coming out of this last wire bit and before it goes into the hoop. Okay, it's very easy. If you don't connect it here, then it will not correctly lift the break, and it won't correctly pinch the yarn, and it won't actually function as the break it needs to be. Okay, so what is a heel spring good for? A heel spring is good for two purposes. One, managing the slack of the yarn as you work back and forth. And you might work back and forth if you are working a heel or a toe, or if you're working flat knitting, meaning you're making a rectangle piece of knitting. The other thing you may use a heel spring for when it's attached is to make a finer gauge or a tighter gauge stitch. So some people, their machines are configured in a way that a certain range of stitches is possible. And other persons, the thing called a V-cam has a different angle and has a higher range of stitches capable on that machine. So many things dictate how tight or loose a stitch will be. Fiber settings, all kinds of things that affect that, as well, of course, as the design of the V-cam and how much weight's on the machine. But in any case, so this is the topper. Let's install it. And we're going to install it by putting the edge of the post of our yarn mast in the hole at the end. Now you want to install it in such a way that it's flush to the top. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my flathead screwdriver. Please use no magnetized things in any way anywhere near your machine. So please consider not putting your iPhone on the machine or near your cylinder needles. Please consider not using a magnetic row counter. Those things are bad. Also, avoid using any magnetized tools. So this is a flathead screwdriver without magnets at all. So I'm just going to gently tighten the screw that will hold the post in place. And there we go. Now it's secure. And I'm going to put the end of the post in the mount of the bed plate. And I'm just going to, for housekeeping that you can't see, I'm just going to hook the heel spring there, just so I won't have it flying around. So this is what that looks like. Okay. So now we're done with the top, and it's basically aligned where this hoop will be aligned to the center of the machine when the yarn comes through. Now we're ready for the next step. Now we're ready for the cog ring, which we introduced before. It has the cogs or gear on the bottom, and we're looking at the top part of it. This is where the next components sit in. All right. So one of the questions I've had in the past is, how often do we need to clean any of the parts? Well, if you have excessively hairy fibers that leave a lot of fiber debris that gets oily and kind of builds up, then you want to check them as needed. But generically, if you've only used the machine a few times, you really don't need to clean it too much. I like to keep a dollar store paintbrush that's about 1 inch wide, like a tiny broom, and I just broom off any excess fibers that are sitting there. It's easier. So now that I've placed the cog ring on its first edge down at the bottom, you can hear it. It needs oil. So we'll make sure we add some before we really use the machine. All right, and now the next step is to add the cam shell. Now this is the cam shell. It's called the cam shell because it is a shell. So just try to think of it as the shell, and it holds what are called cams. So I want to show you something here. See where my thumbs are? These are the pegs that hold something called uplift cams. On this machine, they're like an auto knitter. The uplift cams are these teardrop shaped things, and they have fallen off. They are sitting in the little bin I just pulled this from. That is done on purpose so I can show you what it looks like without them in place. Now do know that what normally goes here is not interchangeable. It can't go over here, no problem. It can't go in upside down, none of those things. So the left one has to stay in the left and the right one has to stay in the right. And they simply sit on these little nubs to hold them in place. Now this is a upgraded machine. Design is just the green. So where you see this chrome piece and this chrome piece, these parts were not on this machine originally. They are masterfully updated and added to be now part of this machine to make it a better one. So this whole component here is new, as is this one here. It's attached by this screw, as is this one over here. Do not undo those, please. And these parts here are going to hold the cams on the inside, so do not undo those either, please. All right. What you're also looking at here is something called a tension cam or V-cam. It's called a V-cam, more easily seen, because it is a big V. And how straight edge this is, or curved or indented or any of those things, dictate the range of stitches possible on your machine with the yarn that you're using and the weight. This has a nice slow and even slope, which will possibly allow you for the ability for many different stitch settings. We'll have to see how it works out. But if you look here, it has this nut on top. All right, so let's turn it back around. So this is a very sophisticated part that looks more simple than it actually is. So this part is simply a post with threads on it, kind of like a bolt, or yeah, a bolt all the way through, pretty much. And there's this nut that turns. This has a bunch of numbers on it. Disregard the numbers. I'll tell you why later. But with the bunch of numbers, this nut is what loosens or tightens your stitches, okay? And you see there's a bunch of threads like for a bolt. Now what's happening is this is holding the V-cam on, which is mounted by a special spring and I think there's a ball bearing in here. So try not to take this part ever apart, because how it goes back together is such a way that will allow it not to drift or loosen when you're using it. And it's just better that you just try not to take it apart. There's no need to take it apart unless the screw, or rather unless the spring is dead or broken and it's no longer pushing and doing its job. This part do not undo, ever, if you can. You can tighten it up, you can tighten it down, but don't take it off, please. All right, great. You can certainly clean around it with any fiber, but that's it. All right, great. So this is the cam shell, the shell of the machine. All righty, that's what it looks like. And what's going to happen when we have needles in the machine is this teal ridge here is where the needles are going to ride around the machine. Down and then up and then all the way around and continue. So when we install this on the machine, it sits in this nice little channel here. So the important thing when we're looking at this is to put it in the correct alignment. This is the yarn carrier. You can see that there's these little ramps I mentioned earlier, and then the yarn carrier. So when we are looking at this camshell, we want to make sure we don't put it on backwards. Now, how would you, the person doing this, know which is forward, which is backwards? Well, actually, if you turn it around and we look at it, what parts could want to be between two stoppers? Well, maybe this, or maybe this. This is the spot we want to have right in front of the yarn carrier, okay? This will make more sense in a minute. So when we look at it, on this one, either this one or this one need to be between these two stoppers. Definitely the tension dial in front of the yarn carrier, okay? This is going to be the yarn carrier. So all we have to do now is gently put this on the assembled cogwheel there, and you can see it slides nice. And how you know it's in the right area? Do you hear those noises? On the cogwheel, those little ramps, they are connecting with the base of the tension dial. So let's just tip it and we can show you what I mean. Okay, so here, if we were going in one direction, it would push. And if we were going in the other direction, see here, it would push. That's all it needs to do. So you can imagine if you have put this on backwards, the two stopper ramps would not be contacting the right areas and being able to connect with the pushing activity needed. And that's pretty much it there, okay? So our parts are all together there. Great. So the next step I like to do is I like to put the yarn carrier on. Now this is the vintage yarn carrier. Generically, we tend to work on most machines in forward more than we go in reverse. So you can see that one side is longer. So here is a shorter side, football kind of shape, and here is kind of a longer one. I find it's easier to see on the inside. This is longer and this is shorter. And the reason why is because you're more often going to be going forward, and so you'll just more often have this be the one going in front when you are working. You'll see in a minute. So when the yarn is threaded in the machine, it comes from that topper part down the last hoop, and it'll come from the outside in. All right, so the important part on here is this area here that will connect to the base of your cogwheel where I showed you before. All right, so all we want to do is you're going to put this U shape on the screw, and it just sits there. Now I'm not going to tighten it yet. It's just going to sit there. We're perfectly okay. So the next step we want to do is we should probably put the cams back in, because we certainly don't want to forget. Those cams, I'll show you a picture in a moment, are going to be the teardrop shapes that sit here, okay? So I'm going to just pull them where I have them, and then we're going to look at them. These are the upthrow cams, and they are pretty much reversed to one another. And this is how they're going to go in the machine. They are slightly curved, and there's an up and a down. So we're going to put them in the machine just like that. I don't know if you can fully see it. Let's just, I'll put them in. And it's just going to sit like that. There and there. And then basically when you're going in one direction, or actually they come down here and they come out, and then in the other direction on the other side it'll go up like a ramp and then go down and then come out. Pretty cool. But these are essential parts that'll eventually wear out after much projects and works and rows. So don't worry about it now, but it's something that when anything goes sideways or something gets stuck inside and you force it, try not to force it. You won't have any damage done to the metal if you stop when there's any resistance you don't know what is for. All right, so there we go. Let's continue now that we have our cams back in. We haven't forgot them, but do be careful. You saw how easy it was to have them fall out because they were out when I added it to the machine. All right, good. All right, so the next step is we're going to add the crank wheel to the crank wheel post. And one thing to note is almost every single machine I've seen out there isn't universally attached and have universal clearance when we're using it. So let's make sense of that. First, we're going to introduce you the crank wheel. This is slightly smaller crank wheel, beautifully designed, balanced. It has this counterweight by my thumb that you can see there. It has this wood permanently installed handle. It's nice and turned. You can hear a bit of noise there. You might want to lubricate it with something that would be okay with wood in there. You don't have to, but it adds extra noise. Try not to add any lubricant to the wood on the inside. That would cause the wood to have problems. Of course, some people do put wood oil on the inside there to help lengthen or extend the time of the wood so that it doesn't get too dehydrated with time. The outside is laminated, but you know. All right, so anyways, so you see this here has the cog wheel. Let's turn it over. So the cog wheel on the machine, those gears are going to connect here. So over time, you might find with much rows of work done that some of the paint might contact the other metal, and maybe over time it wears off a little bit. Perfectly fine. All right. The good thing about having a fresh redo refurbish from a refurbisher who's very well done at their job, the powder coating, which is I believe what this is, I think it is something that is like a hard candy coating. It makes the metal preserved. It prevents any rust. It's going to give you so many more years than you probably got in order to work with it. So it's pretty awesome. Treat it nice, it'll treat you nice. So there you are. This is the crank wheel. We're going to put it on the machine now by putting it on the post through this hole. All right, here we go, through the hose. You can see that there is a small hole here. I believe this hole is for where oil can be dropped into to give you a further, to give you a further smoother turn. So I don't know if you can see it, but I've just wanted, here's my example. So what I like to do is before we start tightening, the, there we go, the crank wheel, let's see if it clears. And by accident, I did exactly what I wanted to show. If I had tightened the screw in this alignment, we have collision. So how do we fix that? Well, we have access to it. So still not attached permanently. Let's just turn it a bit and now re-engage to the teeth. Now we're just going to slowly see if we have any collisions. No collisions. And nothing should change as long as it's fully attached correctly. No collisions. So at this point, I can now put my washer and screw on. The washer is so that the contact keeping this on doesn't stop the wheel from turning. This will make more sense in a minute. All right, so this is the washer and this is the screw. Don't lose these things. They're important together. So the screw will hold the washer in place, which will rotate, and it won't be bound then. I'm just going to finger tighten it. There we are. All right. Use my flathead non-magnetic screwdriver and just tighten it enough that it's secure. Perfect. So now I know that it's firmly attached and there's no binding points, no collisions that are going to happen. Great. All right, I'm going to turn it back into the alignment that I prefer, which is for better ergonomics, like this. All right. You can hear the metal on metal. I wouldn't do a whole sock without adding any oil here. Often people don't put enough oil. And certainly you can't hurt the machine by putting too much. You might just make more of a mess. Some newly fabricated parts don't have enough oil covering the parts, and the parts themselves are too fresh. And if not having enough oil, they won't be lubricated enough while they are being seasoned. Kind of like a frying pan would need the oil to keep it seasoned. In any case, this has no oil yet. Do not worry about oil yet. All right, so what's the next step? The next step is to add our cylinder to the machine. All right, so this is the cylinder we have for this machine. Now this machine is, like I said, a very vintage machine. Its brand name is the Cooperative. This machine in this cylinder does not have the markings most cylinders have. Most cylinders have a stamp on the bottom that might say 12 gauge. And most cylinders have the number of slots this machine might have on stamped right here. And this cylinder sometimes might say 4.5, which is the inches across from the inside diameter. So that is not what this one has. But when we're looking at this, we can see the very bottom, this is the bottom, has this ridge. And that slots go from the top all the way down to the bottom. All right, that's kind of cool. The inside you see is red. This is a standard, I understand, process of protecting the inner metal, and more often than not, they've been red. All right, so I showed you the bed plate before with the 2 screw holes. The cylinder will be placed in the machine, and screws will be inserted into the areas that need that and be tightened up into here. Now it is the cylinder itself that is threaded, so if you are using your cylinder screw and there's some resistance, discontinue. Maybe you've got the wrong screw, maybe there's some debris that needs to come out, because you do not want to mess around with the threads inside the cylinder. All right, so let's look at the cylinder a bit more. Now we turn it sideways and we can see the cylinder spring. There's this divot or ridge in the cylinder of this model, like many auto knitters and Lagares, where this cylinder spring, as you can see, the cylinder coils are quite firm and connected, even, and they are doing their job by holding the needles when they are placed in, like a girdle, into these slots. So this is something that if you aren't aware of it, it's easy to damage your cylinder spring. So make sure that you look after it and try not to force any of the coils. I'm just looking at the slots. So with a lot of use, you're going to find there are debris, yarn debris that gets caught down the slots, and they're going to get caught anywhere along this whole edge. So sometime in the future, after you've done many things, you're going to find maybe the needles stop reacting correctly, or they're sluggish or something. Make sure you clean it. It's not taking a lot of work, but you might need to manually run something all the way through each slot. I'm just showing you that you could do that. You don't have to do that at this point because it's barely been used. So that's what the slots look like. Very cool. Excuse me, let's turn it over. And let's look on top. So you see these marks that I've placed here. Marks are preference. You can mark anywhere on your cylinder, on any configuration, really. But I have marked these for the 72 needle slots that there are, for what works out if you were wanting to do a sock. Whether or not you ever do a sock, these are the marks that happen in this layout, but maybe not this orientation. So this cylinder does not have a front or back in terms of which way to install it. So you can see here, these are the cylinder screw attachment parts, and I'm lining them up underneath. But if I put it in the machine this way, that's perfectly fine. If I turn it around and I put it in that way, that is also perfectly fine. Many of our machines in North America have one side with a little hole somewhere in the middle for the river, and it'll only be on one side. So if your cylinder doesn't have that hole, you can probably put it in any way you want, as long as you connect with the 2 holes on the bottom. This one doesn't have a good or bad side, so you can pretty much do whatever you want. So in this example, I'm going to gently put it down into the inside of the machine, and I'm lining them up with the screw holes there and the screw hole here. Perfect. So these marks here, I have lined them up and counted them out so that this 6 o'clock mark, 12 o'clock mark, 3 and 9, these are identical on the 72 cylinder. This is 36 stitches. This is 36 stitches. Oop. This is 36 and this is 36, and that's the benefit to 72. How the general guideline for heels and toes goes is that if we work on a heel or toe, we use half the needles are 36, and for that we would go 12, 12, and 12. And so these are the borders of an average heel that we would decrease, stop, increase, because these ones are usually left in work, and that's for an average heel or toe. Some people like to make one that starts wider or just does the average. You have many options, but anyways, that's what these marks are. Some people choose to do the heel on one side and then the toe on the other. I like to do both the heel and toe on the same side of the machine. I can see everything and it's just easier. So next step is to secure the cylinder into the machine, because at no point should it ever be wiggly. All the parts need to be firmly attached. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to grab the cylinder screws. I have extra cylinder screws that I'm going to include. These are beautiful screws, very specific. They have a specific thread. I believe it's fine, and the diameter and the length. So what we're going to do is underneath the machine, I'm going to tighten the screws. Now, with anything that you are adding on a machine where there's 2 parts to contact, you can see how I'm trying to find the access there. You want to make sure that you don't overly tighten one without being able to tighten the other one. So I am finger tightening this screw here, and you saw my trick with trying to find the center of the attachment by doing that. All right, good. Now I'm going to do the same over here. Gotta say, it takes the skill to do it on a camera versus to do it with your eyeballs directly. There we go. And the areas are quite tight. Usually I use the screwdriver at this point, but maybe magic's with me at this point. There we go. And so when we firmly attached both screws, not over tightening, but tighten them enough, we want to make sure all the parts are sitting flush. So all right, so with both screws tightened, nothing should move, okay? This is the firmly attached part. Great, so now let's look at this. What happens next? Let's introduce you to the other parts before we proceed. Okay, so with your machine also comes a stem weight. This is a stem weight, and that's just basically a stem weight plus 2 pucks. This is one with the hook, and then we add weight pucks. Generally, you can leave the stem plus the 2 extra pucks 24/7 on it, and they just slide in and they sit. Now, vintagely created, they don't always stay on. I mean, generally they do. So what I like to do is I have created for you, I've created this ribbed sock, and it's double thick that you can just put over the whole pit and it'll keep them together because they only ever are used together. So that's what that looks like. So just leave it together like that, and we just hang it when we need it. Good. What else do we have for the machine? Well, in order to hang that weight on the machine when it's time, we're going to use this Chambord CSM buckle. The buckle that came with the machine originally was one of a very, very old style. And personally, I find it's too hard to use. I have tried. Here comes my kitty. Hi, Polly. Hi. So there's these teeth here of this buckle that don't damage your project, that allow you to hang the weight while also being able to adjust it, move it up. Because eventually you'll have a piece that's so long, the knitting and the weight's going to hit the floor. And the last thing you want to do is have that happen, because when it happens, there will be no downward pressure on your needles and things will stop having success. Okay, so this is the buckle. I kind of have a ha-ha when I look at it. It reminds me of a pumpkin jack-o'-lantern. There's the eyes and the nose and the mouth. But anyways, yeah, it's a very good buckle. It's a little bit narrow sometimes, but it works well. Most of the time, it's great. All right. All right, what else do we have? Well, the vintage machines had something called a V-hook, which basically is very aptly named. It's a hook that's V-shaped. Dave Lore's Chambord CSM has made an upgraded version, which is longer and easier to manage in the machine. It's this V shape that you see here. The weight will be hung here. That I have for it, that we'll supply. And on the top of each of these two bits of the V are hooks. So when we make a heel or a toe, we leave the other weight on the machine, and we need to add pull down weight in the area we're working. So if we were working on our sock here, and we are working on this side, these stitches would be held and they would be up. And we would use our V hook by adding it to the inside, actually turning it around, adding it to the inside between the machine and the knitting. So this makes it so much easier because you can just gently hook to your knitting, add the weight, and as you work, you'll have more success with that downward weight. The other options people have is they use something called they use something called heel forks. And they're really that. They're forks that are made to work on the heel or toe. And literally you hang inside, inside, and inside. And three things that you have to manage is three things, too many things. So this is easier. All right, so we have all the outside parts connected. We don't have the yarn carrier tightened yet. It's wiggly in the wind. And let's do the next step. So the next step is to put our needles in. This machine does not have a cylinder spring rest. Again, this is the cylinder spring. So some machines, auto knitters, Lagares, etc., they have a part that comes up that you can gently rest the spring on, give you some open slack, and then you could drop the needles in easier or take them out. This one doesn't have that. It's pre that thought. So other things you can do instead, I mean, it's not a big deal, but I am showing you these needles. So these are the auto knitter needle. One thing you should consider when you're using the needles in the machine, moving them around, we want to try to baby the spring. We want those coils to be firm and tight for as long as possible. When they get stretched out because you weren't paying attention by accident, they lose their restrictive holding power. So that's important to note. All right, so we can start putting needles in anywhere on the machine. We want to put a needle in every slot. So here's a cylinder needle that I'm holding upside down that I'm going to put the butt in, and it's being held by the spring. That's my first needle. And you could add your needles anywhere you want on the machine. We want to put one in every slot. There's 72 slots. So here's my next needle being held upside down as well. I find that when you have the butt in the spring, it'll help hold the spring in place. So I've sat the needle previously, in and up. And so I'm going to do the same with that one too. So now you might find it a little bit easier to gently pull out those 2 needles. Now you have full access to the spring. It's very easy to maneuver. This in no way is going to damage any of those coils. However, if you just grabbed one of these needles and started wrenching on them, you may stretch the coil. It's not fragile, but you know, you just gotta treat it nice. So I want you to do that all the way around the machine. So one reason why I'm showing you this way is I would like you to be familiar with the parts. When you are familiar with the parts and something goes sideways, you're able to identify what that problem might be and you can fix it. For example, sometimes, you can easily drop something into the slot where at the bottom of the machine, those needles are sitting. See how they're now sitting on that green ridge I showed you in the beginning? If you should drop another needle in there, you want to fish that sucker out. If you drop any kind of debris in there, you want to fish it out. If it's a bit of yarn, I mean, it's life, not life and death, but it might not be a bad idea. Now, I can certainly add needles by simply pushing into the slot and making it open. But in my opinion, in my mind, this is too much pressure. You may wear out the coil by pushing into it like that because the needle foot, this part here is not sloped, it's just curved. We don't want to damage anything. If you are more gentle, it'll last longer, okay? So if you were to ask, what do I need to get, if anything, for the machine? One of the things I ask people to consider getting is to ensure you have at least 50 more needles than you need, at least. Maybe even 100. You may not break any for some time, if ever, but it's always better to have a few more than a few less. Some people have asked, can you fix a needle that you've broken that has bent? Honestly, in my opinion, the latch itself is sitting in a little slot, and if things bent the latch and re-changed how it sat, I feel it's unretrievable because it just breaks again. You can decide what works for you. If you put a needle in time out, feel free to consider having it in some more oil, shaking it up, and see if it has a second opportunity to behave. Some needles never get oil on the latch. It's not the biggest issue, but it can help things be a little better. So now that I've gotten everywhere on the machine, the benefit to having it on a stand that you can actually turn is you can give yourself further access. If your machine, by turning everything, if your machine had a rotating cylinder, this part would be easier because you could just rotate the cylinder without having to rotate your setup. It's not a big deal. All the needles are on the counter behind me, of course. All right, so something to consider. This machine is an open cam machine, which means that those teardrops you saw, they're in a system that is slightly open. It's a little harder to tell on this machine, but compared to a machine, for example, that is a closed cam, the wall of the machine is another example to see it, that a closed cam, the wall of the shell is much higher. What the heck's an open cam machine? Well, an open cam machine is as good as any machine out there, but it's one that you cannot just ram it in reverse to get out of your parking spot. You have to lift a certain number of needles in order for those teardrop things to clear the bottom of the needle, the foot, the butt, whatever we call these things. Offhand, I forget the lingo of the needle names. So it's not impossible to go in reverse, but what it means is if we go in reverse without lifting needles on this style machine, we're going to jam. All right, so one of the other things that we need to do, I think you need to at least lift half the machine, quarter to half the machine needles. And those needles would be more obviously laid out in a pattern that you would see that the need for. So if you needed to make a heel, you need to go back and forth, those needles would be up because you have raised them to do the heel. But doing a heel sample would tell you which number of needles you need to lift. So just know at this point, you can't just throw it in reverse, all right? You just cannot. The other thing that's important is for any CSM work is when you are moving this handle, do not move it uncertain. Forward, backward, forward, backward, forward, backward, forward, backward. Make sure whenever you're moving the handle, you could gently move it forward if you're going forward. And then the other question is, which way's forward? Which way's reverse? Well, on a CSM, most CSMs out there, forward means the knitting is happening in a counterclockwise way. That is forward. And we can further verify that because look at the angulation of your yarn carrier as it goes forward. This one was longer, remember? So that will be more clear as you go. Now, what about reverse? You lift the needles that you need, and then you can go reverse, no problem. Okay? The other thing that new users often first do is they push on that wooden handle like they are being rescued. They push it so fast when there is no fiber on the machine knitted, the latches are going to misbehave. That's just what they do. It's like mom's out, hey, let's misbehave. So what you want to do is you want to minimally, slowly move the yarn carrier, which is this guy. When you move the handle, it moves the yarn carrier. Only ever move it in a slow method whenever there's no yarn on there, because you do not want to clash and bash any of these expensive needles. Okay? And when your yarn, or rather when your machine is threaded, you shouldn't have any problems with latches behaving themselves, because that's when they work. They work when the yarn is there. Good, all my needles are in the machine. There is no fiber on the machine, so we're only going to move the yarn carrier gently. And you'll note that the yarn carrier is loosey-goosey because it's not tightened yet, which is fine. Okay. So one thing that we note is the yarn carrier needs to be low enough to correctly catch any yarn path as it goes by, but high enough to be in the right alignment. And then your question is, well, how high and how low? I'll add a picture so you can see. I'm going to just tighten the screw now on the base of the yarn carrier, so I have some consistency and it's held nice and firm. Now the yarn carrier is very close. So close but not touching. Now because this is a one-piece vintage one, I cannot get it any closer. So if it's successful knitting, that's all that matters. All right, so the next thing. So now that there are needles in the machine, I can go forward with no needles raised. Do not do this. I cannot go back. See how it jams? So if I wanted to go in reverse, I would have to continue going forward and take a certain number of needles up, go past that point, and then you can come back, okay? So that's where it starts to go back and it can't. It's not a big deal. So there we go. Okay. And you see how some of the needles are quickly dropping. If the yarn is correctly in the alignment, none of those lose their stitches, okay? All right, so some people, they say, well, how do I know the cylinder's good? Or rather, the cylinder spring is good. Well, if you noticed that these areas here have this metal bit, and this metal bit's trapping the butts, so the feet of these needles. So if I tried to raise the needles, if I could, they'd be stuck. So don't worry about that. Whenever we're doing things on the machine, we prep in advance for the next step. So when I cast on, I always cast on ahead of the machine. So I like to stop at 6, and I'll start either at the 3 or anywhere after. I like to give the machine a portion of needles to give the machine the time to do the working of going up and going down. So by giving enough time in advance, it has enough time to successfully work if that's there. So I have made this special bonnet to go with this machine. It is a cylinder specific bonnet, meaning that there are 72 needles here. There is this number of rings needed for this specific cylinder. So when we cast on, we use every second needle. There's no need to use more. So this edge of this cast on bonnet has 36 rings. So we will hang 1 ring on every second needle, okay? Another thing that I've made special to this bonnet is the old school method, meaning the old school method of bonnet making was where one did not use rings, one just hung a fiber strand. So for this demo, I'm going to use the fiber strand just to show that this is something that you can use multiple ways, okay? So how do we do that? Hang it in the middle of the machine. This edge has not been used to cast on yet, so there's no distinctive threads that are hanging out. So all I'm going to do is find one of the threads I want to use. I think I'll use this one because it's very prominent and easy to see. Here's another benefit to this stitch tool is if you had a knot that was a real pain in the tush, you could simply put the tiny end in the tiny knot and push it through, and your knot would no longer be knotted. It's easier to get to. But anyways, I digress. So here we go. First loop on the first needle after 3. Now, we only need to hang every second needle. So the next loop on your bonnet, the next loop on the bonnet, I'm going to pick the same one. Once this is cast on once, you're going to find it easier to use. So 1, 2 areas. Now this next one, 3rd needle, 3rd fiber ring. All right, so we're going to hang every nub, every 2nd needle. All right, see that there? Let's keep going. So again, once this bonnet's been used like this at least once, these loops will be more prominent and you will have an easier time locating them if you choose to use this edge of the bonnet. I'm a big fan of the split ring end, but I wanted to give you a bonnet that has both ends available. I have had no problems using split rings. If you use them correctly, nothing has any issues, any damage, nothing. I've been using them extensively, many times, since I got into CSMing, which is basically 218. All right. Oh, I'm off the screen. I'm like, oh, can you see? There we go. So you can see I've hung just over half, or rather just over a quarter of the machine. I want to keep going. So at any one time, part of the machine will not be readily available. The needles will be down. So we do things in stages. Sorry, we do things in stages. So hang all the bumps every 2nd needle. Oh, so now here you may not see it. The needles are going down. Try not to hang a loop on any needle going down. So if there's like 3 from the very end of these needles going down, stop. All right, great. So now, one thing you want to know about the machine is we never turn the handle if there's no weight holding down your knitting, because if you do, things drop because they're not in the correct position. So this one time with the cast on method, any cast on method, you want to pull down, leaving all the knitting basically right against the cylinder. And now I'm going to move the handle. Where's my yarn carrier? I'm going to move it from where it is at 6, and I'm going to bring it over. This is another way to do it. Bring it over to my first applied needle just after 3. While I'm doing it, I can hang, while I'm here, we will hang these other unhung. I can now stop pulling down too much. All right, again, those needles are going down, so I'm going to stop. So now at this point, I'm ready to start making some stitches. So I'm going to grab my fiber, which in this scenario happens to be this acrylic, inexpensive, fingering weight, similar weight scrap yarn. It's better if your yarn is not coming from a skein. It's impossible to use from a skein, or a ball is okay, but not as even as a cone. A cone is preferred because it comes off evenly. All right. So to thread the machine, you can put your yarn source on the floor. You can put it on the table. I prefer to keep an eye on my yarn source, so I'm going to put my yarn source where I can see it, right there. So let me zoom out so you can see what I see. Move my light. Normally I put my light right underneath my topper. So now we're going to take our scrap yarn and we're going to go through the hoop. Good. And we're just going to disengage the heel spring. We're not using it now. It can sit back, just don't let it catch on anything. Now I need to go through the tunnel. Well, another way of doing it, I should probably stand up. Another way of doing it is just take your yarn and fold it over, and I twist it. Gives you a little bit easier of a thread. And I'm just going to put it through the back hole, which came through the front. Good. Now, I'm not going to use the heel spring anytime soon. You can simply leave the heel spring hanging in the wind. Hanging in the wind behind, just sitting there. Okay, you totally can. Let's just do that. Easier. And now you've threaded the tunnel. Keep the yarn on top. Put it in the loop and now put it in your basket. Finger, one-handed touching. There we go. Ready? There we go. So you can see that there. All right. This is a better way to do it, because if you do it this way and when it's time to use your heel spring, you just bring that guy forward and this hook would grab the yarn right here before it goes down the hole. And that's how you engage your heel spring. So let's just always leave it this way. Out of the tunnel, over the bar, through the hook, and then in the basket. All right, so now my scrap yarn is coming out the top. Now you don't have to do this. Some people just hold it, but I like using both of my hands when I need to do something. So I prefer to use a clip, which I'm going to add for you, okay? I also use hemostats, but I have extra these, so I will give one of these. I'll give you 2 of these. So you don't have to do this, but I like to do it just to secure the end. Actually, you have to thread your yarn carrier first. I keep forgetting that my machine doesn't have this need to thread. It's a slotted, but anyways. So again, I twisted it over, easier to thread the whole of the yarn carrier I've shown before. And now I have the yarn tail. The yarn tail I am going to clip. Okay, so I'm just going to take my clip and I'm just going to clip somewhere there. And the reason why I do that is that so I can pull it snugger. I've pulled back on the source, and so that it's nice, no slack, okay? Perfect. So now what we're going to do is we're going to slowly come forward. All right, so let's have a look. As we approach that first needle, it's perfect, okay? So I'm just going to go forward. Wait, so right now there is no weight on the machine. So I'm going to take my left hand and watch what happens when I pull on the bottom of the fabric. All right, so I'm just going to go forward while I'm pulling down. Do not ever move the handle that I'm holding to move this forward unless there's pull down. So I'm just going to look. So it's a perfect alignment. Oh, a needle dropped. All right, so that means my yarn carrier is too high. Okay, my yarn carrier is too high. And when I say it's too high, it should be like the hole should be a little bit lower, like where my finger is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to loosen that screw that's on the outside. And if you see what happens to you and your yarn carrier just drifts, then make sure your yarn path is still going through the needles, because that's what's also happened there. You got it. All right, so we have a dropped needle and we can't reverse to re-get it or redo it. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna catch it with my stitch tool. Can you see that? No, okay. Just adjust the yarn carrier. It's too high. Is it too high? There. all the way down. So when you install the yarn carrier, make sure it can't go down any further. It goes all the way down and it's tight. And then tighten it up again. All the way down. Perfect. I didn't have it all the way down before. This has to be all the way down. All right, so let's look back here. And now you have all kinds of loosey things going on. So pull back on your yarn source. And let's have a look. Now, one of the needles dropped already. Don't worry. Okay? It should be better now. I'm going to pull down again, and we're going to go forward a couple stitches. There we go. All right, so I'm going to stop, and I am going to hang the rest of these stitches. I'm trying to use the same orientation. Oops. Now, if you accidentally start hanging every needle, you're going to run out of things to hang. So undo it and hang the right one. Every second needle. Is that right? There we go. Now, what some people did in the olden days is they left their old project on their machine so they didn't have to cast on again. So if we have scrap, and we do, you could just simply leave the extra scrap on the machine. You wouldn't have to cast on again. It is fast once you do it more than once. And you know what to look for and you have the right settings. For a moment there, I was like, uh-oh, I'm out of needles. Nope, I got it. There we go. So all of the loops are now hung. The yarn carrier is right there. So let me just put it back. There we go. So now we add the weight through the buckle. All right, so let's review the buckle. This is the buckle. We mentioned it briefly before. So when you look at it, there is a hole on top and there's a bar on the bottom. So this is what you remember. Eye to the sky. Okay, and then look at it. Which way does it open? Does it open both ways or just here? It just opens this way. So if it opens this way, then I'm going to turn around so you can see it. But it only opens one way. See how it's opening one way? So open the door. And under your machine, you are going to feed your bonnet in this hole. All right? There. Under your machine, and hang it so that it's not right at the edge so it doesn't fall off. Okay, so now under your machine, now what you do is you take the eye to the sky and you put it to the floor and put a weight through that. All right, let me get the weight. All right, and then it'll hang without any problems, okay? It's enough pressure to stop it. We never move the yarn carrier without weight being pulled down. And while some people might hand pull down their work, I don't believe it's even or recommended. That's why we have buckles and weights. So we're going to try to use them. All right, so I've just added the buckle and the weight underneath, pulled down. Now where I had some oopsies, I can leave them and they should catch on the next run, or what I like to do, hang them now, okay? So, and sometimes that happens because we hung every second loop, but we want every needle to be working, okay? So let's try that. Now I see that this one over here dropped because the fiber's on top, and same here, the needle dropped. But let's keep going. We're on scrap. We're still good. We haven't done our full row yet. So let's keep going. All right. I'm going to hang those ones again. Now, if you just continued knitting, any needle by itself, if it wasn't behaving the first time, will probably be fine the second time. But if there are two needles side by side misbehaving, you're going to have to interact and hang one of them, because two by side don't fix themselves. All right, so let's look. All right, now there is no extra oil on the machine right now, so you should have this success here. What we want to do is, this is our 6 o'clock position. I want my tension dial to be in front of my 6 o'clock position. I always do that this way, so let's do it again. So here is my stitch dial at the 6 o'clock position. So when we look at this, this is our tension dial. This turns. There's a spring here, and this part goes up and down. And when this nut is higher, the stitches are tighter, so closer to the top. When this stitch gauge setting is lower, it's longer away, so it's longer. So at this point, it would make sense that we see these big boxes of stitches, because look at all the threads above the nut. It's quite low, all right? So if we had never done this before and we're doing it fresh like this, I like to do it with the fiber on the machine, because this will at least, even if it's scrap. So what we want to do is, we see, will give us a better tension beginning. 1 thread, 2 threads, 3 threads, and then the top 4. This is our guideline for successful knitting, because that's what we did right here. What we want to do now is set our 0 point. All right, so this dial can move clockwise, and it's not all the way down, and it can move counterclockwise. So if we move it counterclockwise, it's going up, okay, making smaller stitches. If we move it clockwise, it's going down, making bigger stitches. So what we're going to do now is we're going to set our 0 point. That's what I'm going to call it, 0 point. So with an open cam machine, set your 0 point. So gently tighten the knot until it can't be any more tight. Perfect. Cool. And now look on top, it can't go any more tight. Now on top, let's look at which line or number is closest to the 6 o'clock position. Well, it's kind of 4.5, because here's 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then half mark, half mark, half mark, half mark. So technically, it's 4.5 mark. All right. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to get some nail polish, and I'm going to make a 0 point mark. So on your dial, this 0 point mark is the most important. Shake up your nail polish. You can choose to note 4.5, or you can add nail polish like I am. All right. So I'm just going to give myself some room to do this. All right, good. Just need a little bit of color. Okay. And so this is the mark closest to the 6 o'clock. Okay. We'll let that dry. This is our 0 point, meaning that this is the tightest all the way down that this setting can be on this machine. I do not know if I can knit at this setting. That is the positive negative with an open cam machine. An open cam machine sometimes can be too far down or too far up to correctly knit. Things collide. That's fine. As long as you do have an access point and a guide that you can knit at, you know what works. We knew that we had those number of threads a moment ago when we were knitting. And the point here is to be able to reproduce our settings. All right, so shall we try to knit? Let's see what happens. This is at the tightest setting, okay? So there might be a lot of tension. See the change in the tension. You hear that? It's really fighting. I do not recommend it. So let's go back to, you could try it in the future. Well, what's happening is there's very little clearance, okay? And you can see how big those first stitches are from this row. So this is 0 point. So what we're going to do now is any movement to tighten the stitches are going to be in either half turns or full turns. So you see that pink? Now that's the only thing you see on this top part. All right, we're going to do 1 full turn. And when we do tighten it, we are turning it counterclockwise, the tension dial. All right, so that's 1 full turn. We can see how well that knits. Now these are loose. So I don't know if I want to knit so loose. Do you see how much more looser those stitches are? It's successfully knitting. All right, great. That was 1 full turn. Now let's do a total of 2. In fact, I'm going to skip ahead and do a total of 3 from 0. Look at the difference. These are really tight, these are really loose, and these are looser. So this was 3 turns from the 0 point. I love that statement. All right, so with an open cam, you have those number of threads, not really precise, or you can note the number of turns from your 0 point. So that's what we're doing here, okay? Now, if I used a different fiber and I started doing the 0 point, what is the tightest, it may not line up to my 6 o'clock, which is fine. Just use your reference and go from there. Now, by doing that, this allows me to know in the future that if I want to start knitting with whatever fiber or this fiber, then I can just turn it 3 and then go to broke. Then I can make my project. This is the reproducible setting. This is what you need to be able to do. Some people use calipers, which measure the distance between one edge to another edge. And I haven't found digital calipers to be useful or to be reliable. So dial turns. You have a dial, turn it, you got it. So easy. So if you find a setting that works for you, stay with it.